Ever feel like you're walking a financial tightrope? Like trying to balance all your bills, maybe even dipping into savings a little bit?
Yeah.
Well, imagine that feeling, but like for a whole country. That's
Okay.
kind of what's happening in Egypt right now.
Right.
And we're going to deep dive into an article from Restore Nigeria News to try to figure out why.
Okay.
It's called Egypt, like Kenya and Nigeria, teeters on brink of economic ruin as debt mounts and poverty soars. And, well, it paints a pretty stark picture, that's for sure.
One thing that really stands out about this article is it doesn't just throw a bunch of statistics at you.
Mm-hmm.
It tries to connect these economic problems in Egypt to like specific policy choices that have been made over the last decade.
Interesting.
Yeah. And their argument is basically that the government's been so focused on these huge infrastructure projects, most of them funded by debt,
Oh, okay.
that it's ended up costing everyday Egyptians a lot.
So it's kind of like, I don't know, building a fancy new house before you've even paid off your credit cards.
Yeah, exactly.
You end up with this like shiny new facade, but like underneath it all, the foundation is shaky.
Exactly. A shaky foundation. And the article highlights some pretty worrying data points to show just how shaky things are.
Uh-huh.
Like the poverty rate has just exploded, going from 26% in 2012-13
Wow.
to 33% in 2022. That means like 1 in 3 Egyptians now lives below the poverty line.
Jeez.
And then on top of that, a massive 62% of the government's entire budget is now being eaten up just by debt repayments.
Ugh.
Yeah, that leaves very little room for, essential things like social services or safety nets.
Yeah, that's a huge chunk of their budget just going towards interest payments.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like they're trapped in this like, what do they call it? A debt spiral. They're just digging themselves deeper with every loan they take out.
Exactly. That's exactly it. To understand it a bit better, imagine a family that's like drowning in credit card debt, right? They might take out a new loan just to cover the minimum payments on the old ones. But that only helps for a little while. And in the end, they actually end up owing even more money.
Makes sense.
That's kind of the situation Egypt is in right now, taking on new debt just to stay afloat with the old debt, all while the actual economic problems aren't being fixed.
And it feels like it's the everyday Egyptian citizen that's really feeling the squeeze from this financial tightrope walk.
Absolutely.
There's this quote from President El-Sisi in the article that, well, it really struck me. He says, "If progress, prosperity, and development come at the price of hunger and deprivation, Egyptians do not shy away from progress. Don't dare say, it is better to eat."
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a very striking quote.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about what their priorities are. Are they more concerned with these big flashy projects, or are they concerned with the basic needs of their people?
It's almost like he's saying, embrace progress, even if you have to go hungry, which is, it's a tough thing to hear.
Yeah.
Especially when you think about how many Egyptians are already struggling just to afford basic necessities.
Yeah, no, it's a very difficult message to process. And that's where this idea of regressive taxation comes in, which the article also talks about.
Oh, okay.
Imagine a system where the sales tax on something like bread, a basic food for most people in Egypt,
Right.
is actually higher than the tax on some luxury item. That's essentially what regressive taxation is. It puts more of the burden on the poor and middle class because they're the ones spending a bigger portion of their income on those essential goods.
So I guess what we're seeing is these mega projects might be creating a facade of progress, but it's the everyday people who are footing the bill through higher costs, less access to essential services, that kind of thing.
That's exactly right. And this leads us to another important point the article brings up, the role of the military in Egypt's economy.
Yeah, the article talks about how the military is super involved in a lot of these mega projects, especially that new administrative capital they're building, the one that's estimated to cost something like $300 billion.
Yeah,
That's mind-boggling.
it is.
What's the thinking behind that? Why involve the military so heavily?
Well, the article argues that Egypt basically operates under what's called a militarized economy. So in this kind of system, the military has a lot of control over different parts of the economy, including things like construction and development. And while that might seem efficient on the surface, it often comes with a lack of transparency and accountability.
So even though these projects are being sold as these big drivers of economic growth, we don't actually know if they're benefiting the people or if they're just making a select few richer.
Yeah, that's the concern the article raises. It questions whether there's enough oversight and whether the supposed economic benefits are actually reaching the average citizen.
Sounds like a recipe for potential corruption and a widening of the wealth gap.
Precisely. And that's something we're going to look into more as we keep going with this article. And it's not just the military where we see this lack of transparency. The article also points out that Egypt's economy is becoming more and more reliant on support from other countries, especially those in the Gulf.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's almost like, when you have to borrow money from a friend. It can be helpful in a pinch, but if you have to do it all the time, you can end up feeling trapped.
Right, you become dependent on them.
Exactly. The article talks about Egypt's current account balance, which is basically a way to measure if a country is making more money from selling things to other countries than it's spending on buying things from other countries.
Okay.
Egypt's current account has been negative for years now.
Hmm.
That means they're importing more than they're exporting, and that gap, that difference, is being filled with loans and investments from other countries.
So I'm sensing a pattern here. Mega projects funded by debt, a growing dependence on money from other countries. Sounds like they're getting short-term gains, but might be setting themselves up for problems in the long run.
Yeah, you're picking up on exactly what the article is saying.
Yeah.
They're basically arguing that Egypt is going to need this outside support just to stay afloat. But that kind of dependence comes at a cost. It can limit their economic freedom, make it hard to make their own choices, and it could even open them up to pressure from those lenders, like maybe political pressure.
So who exactly are these lenders and what's in it for them?
The article specifically names the IMF and the UAE as some of the biggest players. They even talk about this one $35 billion investment from the UAE that basically saved Egypt from defaulting on its debts. But while that was a big help in the moment, it also made Egypt more dependent on the UAE, both financially and maybe even politically.
Okay, so break this down for me. How could a foreign investment lead to political influence?
We'll take this example from the article. It says the UAE got a 30% stake in the Eastern Company, which is owned by the Egyptian government and controls most of the tobacco market there. And the UAE also financed the sale of some really important historical hotels.
So they're essentially selling off valuable parts of their country to these foreign investors. I mean, I guess it makes sense that it would bring in some quick cash, but doesn't that also mean Egypt is losing control of important parts of its economy?
Exactly. And the article is saying that this trend is chipping away at Egypt's economic independence and making them more and more beholden to these external forces.
It's kind of unsettling, like they're slowly selling off their economic freedom. Does the article offer any hope, any ideas for how they can turn things around?
Well, they don't lay out a step-by-step plan, but they do say that a fundamental shift in priorities is needed. They're suggesting that instead of focusing on these mega projects that often only benefit a small group of people, they should invest in the Egyptian people themselves.
So instead of building these huge, often kind of secretive projects, they should focus on things like social safety nets, education, healthcare, making sure wealth is distributed more fairly, things like that.
Exactly. It's about creating an economic system that works for more people, not just a select few at the top. And I know it sounds overwhelming, but the article does offer a little bit of hope.
Oh, yeah. What's that?
They talk about how important citizen engagement is. They say that if people are informed and if they demand transparency and accountability from their leaders, they can be a really powerful force for change. Even when things look really tough, the article suggests that a better future is possible, but only if people are aware and involved.
So in the end, what can we as listeners take away from Egypt's experience? What's the bigger lesson here?
Yeah, it really does feel like we've uncovered this tangled mess of problems in Egypt.
Yeah.
Mounting debt, a shrinking industrial sector, relying too much on foreign money, and this growing gap between the rich and the poor.
And we can't forget about the impact this is all having on real people.
Right. The article really drives this home by talking about how much the price of bread has gone up.
Ah, yeah.
The bread is a basic food in Egypt.
It is.
And while these real estate guys like Hisham Talat Mustafa are seeing their profits explode, millions of Egyptians are having trouble even putting food on the table.
Yeah, it really hits you that these economic numbers aren't just numbers. They represent actual people's lives.
Absolutely.
This disparity, this feeling that the system is rigged against them, it's got to be creating a lot of anger and frustration among everyday Egyptians.
Absolutely. When people feel like they're being squeezed, like their basic needs aren't being met, it creates a lot of tension. It's like a pressure cooker just waiting to blow.
So where do we go from here? What can be done to tackle all these interconnected challenges?
Well, the article doesn't offer some easy fix. And to be honest, there isn't one. But they do say that a major shift in priorities is needed. They suggest moving away from this model of focusing on mega projects and instead putting the focus on investing in the Egyptian people themselves.
So instead of pouring resources into these big, secretive projects, they should be strengthening social safety nets, improving education and healthcare, and making sure that wealth is shared more fairly.
Exactly. It's about building an economic system that works for everyone, not just a small group at the top. And I know it sounds like a huge task, but the article does offer a glimmer of hope.
Okay, what's up?
They emphasize how important citizen engagement is. They argue that if people are informed and if they demand transparency and accountability from their leaders, they can actually be a powerful force for change. Even when things seem impossible, the article suggests that a better future is possible, but only if people are aware and get involved.
So what can we as listeners, as individuals, take away from Egypt's experience? What's the bigger lesson here?
I think Egypt's situation is a really good example that forces us to look closely at economic policies, not just in our own countries, but around the world. It encourages us to ask tough questions like who's actually benefiting from these policies, and are they really meeting the needs of the people? And are they sustainable in the long term?
It's a reminder that we need to be informed, to be engaged, and to demand better from our leaders.
Yeah.
Make sure that progress in any nation doesn't mean that people have to go hungry or be deprived of their basic needs.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even when things are complicated and messy, we all have a role to play in shaping a world that's more just and equitable.
This deep dive into Egypt's economic struggles have been really eye-opening. We've learned about the complexities of economic development and how policy decisions can have real human consequences.
Yeah.
But more than that, it's given us a sense of hope that through awareness, open conversations, and collective action, a more sustainable and fair future is possible, not just for Egypt, but for everyone.